you want to follow along, I'll be doing scripture reading this morning from Genesis, the 12th chapter, starting in verse 1. Genesis 12, starting in verse 1. Now Jehovah said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto the land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and be thou a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and him that curseth thee will I curse. And in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So Abram went as Jehovah had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 70 and 5 years old when he departed out of Haran.
If you haven't already, go ahead and please open up to Genesis chapter 12. That's where we're going to be starting out this morning. We will be kind of moving along through the next few chapters, just focusing on kind of what we started with here in the scripture reading, which is the promises that are given here to Abraham, that are going to set a chain of events of all the things to come. Pretty much from this point on are going to be focused around these promises, whether it's setting them up to be capable of happening to them being fulfilled. Like that pretty much becomes the focus of the story as we go from here, is God's plan of fulfilling these promises as he will through the next many years and many different characters we go through. So this is a very important chapter, and so I'm excited to kind of start here and then begin on this journey with Abraham and with all of you as well. But before I get started, I do want to say thank you again for having me. It's good to be back. It's a nice day out. I don't know why I always feel like it's either really hot or it's really cold when I'm out here, but like this is that one. I get like 1 month that I feel like it's really good that we get to come out here, and so it's a nice day out, and it's a good day to be together with all of you. I've been studying through Genesis recently, which has been exciting because I really haven't studied much of Abraham beyond just kind of the basic, cookie cutter level lessons, and, Abraham and offering Isaac and getting the promises, or, Abraham and Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah. But there's really a fascinating kind of picture when you look at Abraham and you look at these promises being fulfilled. And you see how through all these stories that we're going to read about Abraham and even his children after him, this chapter 12, these first 3 verses, is really the theme of all of it. Every single chapter, every single story about Abraham, about his children, it all comes back to this. These first 3 verses in chapter 12 and them being fulfilled. So it is quite fascinating getting to study through this focused chapter here in verses 1 through 3 of chapter 12. And then see how it expands in its meaning and its value and its truth as we go along. But just reading it one more time before we kind of get started, just so it keeps getting stuck in our heads as we go along, because we're going to be kind of moving forward. So now the Lord said to Abram, Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So Abraham is kind of this new starting point for us, because if you think about it, we've kind of already had 2 births of a nation, of God's creation, when you have Adam and Eve in the garden. And that kind of ends when we see the corruption and the wickedness that comes about, that eventually God kicks them out of the garden. But more importantly, it's kind of ended with Noah, when God brings the flood and wipes out all those people. That wickedness that kind of started there in the garden, God cleanses, brings the flood, delivers Noah and his family. But that chain reaction kind of ends with Noah. And then we pick up and we get a new fresh start in Noah and his children and his new family is going to start over. It's going to be a brand new, fresh start. You know, God gives the covenant with the rainbow and says, I'm never going to flood the earth again. And then we spend even less time together and we realize people start acting wickedly again, and we have the Tower of Babel. And in a way, while God doesn't wipe out the earth, he has a resetting again, where he confuses the language. People are no longer all completely unified by the same talk and the same actions, and so they separate, all right, where literally their main foundation and purpose of building the tower was not just the idea of getting to God, but, hey, let's stay together, let's be united, let's make a name for ourselves. And then in chapter 11, this all goes down, and they get dispersed throughout the earth. And now we have different cultures, different languages, because God has dispersed them. And then chapter 12, we pick up with one new person in that lineage that starts from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And we see how Ham was wicked, and his descendants are going to be evil and wicked, the Canaanites, and all these other nations that are going to be evil and defy God at every turn. And then we see through Shem, though, there's going to be this descendant all the way down to Terah who has these sons, and one of them is named Abram. And in chapter 12, now we pick up with this Abram, who we have no reason to know of why he's significant at all. But now in verses 1 through 3, God offers him these promises. He tells Abram, you're going to be blessed. I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to make a great nation out of you, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. We know these three promises. We often refer to them as the three promises. I do actually think there's kind of a fourth one that is in here that we don't look at it as much, but kind of becomes prevalent as we go through these next few chapters. And that is right at the start of verse 3, if you notice. God says, I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. So while we all kind of have this spoiler, alert already in our heads where it's like, hey, we know how the land's going to turn out. We know how the nation's going to turn out. We even know what the seed promise is. But there's kind of this fascinating thing with that fourth promise, because that's really the one that Abram is going to see directly, consistently, immediately after this promise is extended. The other three, he really doesn't get a glimpse at. He's going to die long before the nation of Israel becomes great and mighty and multiplies in the land of Egypt. He's going to die long before they come back and inherit the land that is promised to them when Joshua crosses over the river and takes over Canaan. And he's going to die long before Jesus comes and fulfills that seed promise. But these next few chapters, we're really going to see how God blesses those who bless Abram and curses those who curse him. And so Abram is going to be constantly getting reminders. And I think this is kind of that reminder promise of, hey, you might not see these other three, but this fourth promise I'm going to constantly give to you to remind you that these promises are assured. And that's really what I just wanted to focus on today, is just going through these next few chapters and just seeing how God continually is reminding Abraham, I might go back and forth on that. There is a name change coming up. But he's going to keep reminding him, and there's a purpose to that. And there's some significance in each of the reminders. Because God doesn't just quote chapter 12, verses 1 through 3 verbatim every single time he reminds Abram about these things. So let's kind of jump into this, and we'll, if we say round one was chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, God has given the grand promises, and these are first introduced to Abram, and now we're on our way. Well, if you jump down into the same chapter, but later on, when God tells Abram to go to Egypt, right? One of the things he says to start this out in verse 1 is, go forth. Leave the land that you've been living in. Leave your family. Leave everything you've known, which is totally something against what everybody would be doing at that time. And he's saying, go forth from here, and I'm going to show you where you need to go. He tells him to leave there. He follows, and eventually, through circumstances, God sends him down to Egypt because a famine arises. All right, this should be sending off warning bells of, foreshadowing events that might be coming down the pike even later than this. But, people of God have to go down to Egypt because there's a famine. Abraham goes down to Egypt. There's some shenanigans that go on where Abram is, so confident in the beauty of his wife, as all husbands should be. All right, you should all feel like Abraham does, that any king that lays eyes on your wife is going to steal her, all right, or kill you and steal her. So, gentlemen, if you want to know how to get a good card for your wife, I think you should say, "I love you like Abram loves Sarah." That would be a good gift. But the truth is, though, this is kind of this first interaction from there where Abram is in this pickle, and which he kind of makes for himself. But, he says, "Hey, we'll tell Pharaoh that you're my sister," which they actually are brother and sister, half brother and half sister. Same father, different mothers, but it's a lie. He's going to be deceitful about it, but Egypt is going to welcome him in. Pharaoh is going to welcome him in. He's going to bless Abram. He's going to give him camels and gifts and wealth, and then he's also going to take Sarah, takes him into his harem, but God starts to curse him. God kind of strikes Pharaoh and his house with plagues. All right, yet again, seems like another foreshadowing of a trip to Egypt that's going to go down. But God's already showing Abram how he's with Abram, in spite of the fact that Abram is lying, being deceitful, has kind of brought a lot of this on himself in not trusting that God would just deliver him outright if he told the truth. But God's already blessing him in verse 17 by showing him, hey, those that are against you, those that are possibly going to take your wife or cause you harm, he strikes Pharaoh. He strikes Pharaoh with these plagues to the point that Pharaoh immediately knows, okay, something's going on. Why didn't you tell me this was your wife? Like, these things wouldn't just be happening. And so Abram and Sarah, they end up leaving. Pharaoh's like, hey, get out of here. There is no hardening of the heart in this time. Like, Pharaoh's just like, get out. Like, I don't want you anymore. But not only does he, kind of plague Pharaoh in this situation, but God also blessed Abram because he received all this wealth, and he's going to leave Egypt with all this wealth. Wink, wink, hint, hint. Like, sounds very familiar to the next time Israel's going to be leaving Egypt. All right? Pharaoh's going to be hit with plagues. Egypt's going to bless the Israelites, and they're going to leave with a exceedingly large amount of wealth. And we know there's a large amount of wealth because if you jump right into the next chapter, just going along with the story, which is kind of round 2, I guess you could say, God shows how much wealth that Abram is blessed with because him and Lot don't have enough space in the land of Canaan to be next to each other. They are so exceedingly wealthy and abundant, there's not enough room for them to be together. They're massive of wealth and people and possessions. If you read in verse 6 and 7, they were getting in fights because there was just overcrowding. They have too much of everything, and so they have to eventually split off. So another reminder, God has already begun blessing Abram and blessing his family and blessing those attached to him, like Lot, one of his kinsmen. So God has already started reminding and showing Abraham, I'm going to bless you. You are going to be blessed. You are going to be wealthy. You're going to be known for your wealth and for your God who is blessing you. And so, but there's a restating of the promises here. First time we see the restating of the promises. If you jump after Lot has separated out from Abram, he's gone to be in the Jordan Valley, this beautiful valley with Sodom and Gomorrah, which is going to bring on some problems for Lot later on. But he chooses the best of the land. Abram gives him first choice. And then we jump into verse 14. After Lot has separated from it, says, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give it to you and to your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise, walk about the land through its length and its breadth, for I will give it to you. All right, and then Abram goes and moves to near the Oaks of Mamre, down in the southern part of Israel, but I guess Canaan at this time. But the interesting thing is here, we have the promises restated, a couple of them. But there's a twist on it, right? Notice the twist. I don't want to say twist is kind of wrong. There's a little bit more focus in this one, right? North, south, east, and west of where you are right now, Abram, everything that you see here will be yours. So we get a little bit more specific. God gets a little bit more specific in this second promise, all right, than he did in chapter 12, which chapter 12 was very great, very vague, I should say. Great nation, I give you land and seed promise. All the nations shall be blessed. Gets a general idea, but doesn't know what land. How big is my nation going to be? What do you mean you're going to bless all the nations through me? I don't understand. Well, here he gives him a little bit more specific knowledge where, hey, I'm going to give you the land that you're seeing around you. Like, if you can see it right now, it's going to be yours. And then he gets even more specific in verse 16 about, all right, what did I mean by a great nation? Well, you've probably never tried counting the dust on the ground, but if you can count it, then people will be able to count how many you have in your great nation that will be yours. All right? So he's given him another layer of specifics on these promises. And think about it, as we're going through here, but why does God keep repeating himself? Why is God going to keep repeating himself? So this is the first time, so he hasn't done it that much. But why does God keep repeating himself? Kind of keep that question in the back of your head as we go forward. But he's going to keep repeating himself. So let's kind of jump to round 3, which is, some of you might say, Caleb, you're going to skip over chapter 14. We're actually going to do chapter 14 tonight for the lesson. I was wrong picking the doom of Sodom was what I was going to do, but I just love chapter 14 so much. I was like, I got to change it. So I told Gene that late last night. I was like, hey, I'm sorry. I got to do chapter 14, and I'll try and contain my excitement tonight, but it's like one of my favorite stories now, and so I'm really looking forward to that. And it is a tie-in with this lesson this morning as well, and you'll see that. So you'll notice one of the promises we don't really talk about as much this morning that I think you'll notice is kind of an important one, but tonight we'll talk a little bit more about chapter 14 and some of the importance that has with it. So round 3, you might say, is in chapter 15. So if you jump to, all right, what's the round 3 of the promises here? Like what's the next layer that God gives to Abram? And well, in chapter 15, we pick up, and time has passed. Time has gone by, how much, not exactly specific, but when you start getting into verse 2 of chapter 15, there is some expression that Abram has on his face that God is going to reach out to him, in this vision. In verse 1, specifically God addressing, saying, hey, do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great. And Abram responds back with this question in verse 2, God, what will you give me, since I am childless and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus? And so it's fascinating because when we're first introduced to Abram, it's in chapter 11. So before we even get to the promises, we first introduced to him in chapter 11. And what sticks out is that it goes through all this huge lineage for Shem, for Ham, for Japheth. And then it gets to this weird point where in a line of genealogies, what's the weirdest thing to see is when they say that there is a wife that is barren. Because if you have a wife that is barren in a line of genealogies, then you're going to be confident that there's not going to be any more to the genealogy, right? And here's Abram, who is married to the one woman in chapter 11 that is told to be barren, which is Sarai. And Abram has some questions. He's a little bit confused. Like, Lord, what can you give me as a childless man, right? Which some of us nowadays, we see in the culture around us like, hey, it's no big deal to have kids. You don't need to have kids. Nobody cares. In this time period, you had to have kids. Like, if you didn't have kids, like, people were like, what's going on? Like, there was no flying solo your whole life, all right? There was no, like, hey, cool bachelors just chilling around. There was no, married couples that just were like, hey, we're not ready to have kids yet. Like, it's just not the same culture that we are accustomed to nowadays. And so Abram is a little bit downtrodden because of this. Despite his blessings and all this stuff, you can see, despite his exceeding wealth, which we already read about with him and Lot in chapter 13, God knows that Abram's still concerned about having his heir. And right now his heir is just someone who's not even his own flesh and blood from his line, from his own body. And in chapter 15, God tells him, hey, I promise you, you will have a son born to you that will be from your own flesh and blood. That will be your son. And so in verse 4, he says, this man will not be your heir, him being Eleazar, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir. And then God continues in verse 5. Look towards the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. And then you have this awesome verse in verse 6 where Abram believed and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Abram believed God when he said that, which seems simple and insignificant, but it's going to transcend through the ages, all the way to what's recorded in Hebrews 11, all right, and how blessed Abram was, but also how Abram was a faithful and righteous man, and this belief that he had in God. It can still say that, and then you might question that a little bit because in the next several chapters, Abram might have some attitudes where you're like, did he really believe he was going to have his own, the way God intended it? But still, Abram believed God. He believed this was going to come to pass. But God gives another line of detail into the process. All right? You're going to have a great nation, and it's going to come from you. You will be the father. All right? And so we pick up in chapter 16. Chapter 16 is more of man's trying to interceding on behalf of what they think God wants to happen. Sarah and Abraham, they're trying to figure out, all right, like Sarah's like, all right, this is definitely not happening through me. You gotta sleep with Hagar, my maidservant. That's the only way this is gonna happen. This is probably what God means. Go sleep with her. She'll bear a child, and then we'll go off from there. And so chapter 16 really is more focusing on man's false idea of how they can accomplish the promises of God. All right? This is how we're going to accomplish these things. And if you notice in chapter 16, and this is something more of just a suggestion, but if you ever have time, just spend some time reading that and see how similar a lot of that chapter is with Adam and Eve in the garden. And Sarah's intentions of getting what she wants, how she's going to achieve it, kind of convincing her husband to do this. Hey, this is what you're going to do. Go do it. This is how things are going to work out. And it's very similar in a lot of ways to how the interaction with Adam and Eve is in the garden as well. But the whole thing is that this is how Sarah's going to get her child. Sarah wants a child. She'll have a surrogate son, and that's going to be my child. But at the end of the chapter, God kind of records this in such a manner that we know it doesn't work out as planned. In verse 15, it says, so Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. Now, it's only 2 verses, but do you think we're meant to forget who is the mother of this child? Have you ever been told so many times who the mother was within just a couple of sentences, right? Whose child is it? It's Hagar. Who was the child born to? It was born to Hagar. And the mother that was born to such a woman, what was her name? It was Hagar, right? Like, it tells us over and over again, this is not Sarah's son. This is not her son. Okay, and this is going to be important because while we know, okay, Ishmael is not going to be the son of promise. Okay, we know that. We've heard enough of the stories. That does not include the people that are going through this right now. Abram is not filled in on what we know right now. All right, Sarah is not filled in. Hagar, Ishmael, like they are unaware of what we we believe and what we know is going to happen with Isaac and so forth going forward. They don't know. They think, hey, maybe this is the plan. Maybe this is what's going to happen. All right, but there is a plan enacted by Sarah, and it's not going to work. Now jump to chapter 17. All right, chapter 17. This is kind of the next round of the promises being fulfilled here. But now, another twist, another addition to the promises. All right, God says in verse 2, I will establish my covenant with you, and I will exceedingly multiply you. So, reminding him again, like I'm going to multiply you and make you great. But notice in verse 4, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. Changes his name to Abraham in verse 5, and that's because I will make you a father of a multitude of nations. So now, it used to be you will be the father of a great nation. Now it's the father of a multitude of nations. And kind of reminds him in verse 6, I'm going to continue to make you fruitful. Kings are going to be descended from your line. All right, and continues reminding him about this establishment of the covenant. If you jump down in verse 15, we have a additional detail on the promises. All right, before he told him, hey, you're going to have a great nation come from you. Then he tells him, hey, you're going to be the father of this great nation. It's going to come from your line, from your body. Didn't mention anything about Sarah last time, which still meant, like, theoretically, maybe Hagar was the right idea. Maybe that was the plan. But God stamps that out here in verse 15 and basically, says, you're going to call her Sarah, and I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. King of peoples will come from her. All right? All right, you're going to have a great nation. You're going to be the father. Sarah's going to be the mother now. Hopefully I don't fall over the edge. If there were any more points, I'd have to fall off the edge. But he's adding layer upon layer upon layer here and just continuing to remind him and give him further details of this. But that's not even the main twist or main add-on of these promises. There's a difference now in chapter 17 because in the previous chapters, since the promise has been extended, you know what God has said, Abram, this is what you need to do. Does anybody know? It'd be fascinating if you do, because I don't think God said one time what Abram is supposed to be doing, or now Abraham. He's given him almost free rein here, like, I'm going to give you these promises, and it had nothing to do with Abraham keeping up his end of the bargain. All right, if you even jump back a chapter real quick, 2 chapters in chapter 15, and just kind of glance through there, there's this ritual that goes through where God has Abraham split these animals in half, which was meant to signify a covenant being done. You split the animals in half, lay the carcasses on either side, and you're supposed to walk through it, and you kind of make a covenant, and it's like, hey, if I break this covenant, may I be as, these animals that have just been massacred before us, right? But in that chapter, if you kind of glance down, Abraham goes into kind of this trance, and God, brings a vision to him and tells him these things and gives him some more detail and gives him some time, and like, hey, your family's going to go off, and they're going to be slaves and strangers in a distant land, and they'll be there for 4 generations, for over 400 years, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not complete. But it talks about how in verse 17, Abraham does not pass through the animals. It says, a smoking oven and a flaming torch passed between those pieces. God was the one that passed through. God was the one promising to Abraham, I am going to fulfill this covenant with you. I am going to achieve all that I am promising. Abraham is not yet a part of fulfilling anything from this covenant. He has not been expected to accomplish anything until chapter 17, where God says, okay, in verse 9, if you jump back to chapter 17 and verse 9, now as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. And goes on through the details of when they're supposed to be circumcised. And it's this great significance of, hey, you're going to show through this act, you will be setting yourselves apart from the multitudes, from everyone else. You are going to distinguish yourselves as someone set apart, applying yourself to this covenant and establishing something that is to last forever. It is a forever covenant. And so Abraham immediately follows through on that. And so we have this new layer of an expectation now of what Abraham is supposed to be doing. This covenant you are supposed to keep through circumcision that is going to be followed along with, and we'll even see, you guys are in Acts now in Bible class, so you're already going to start seeing how the issues with circumcision and how now letting go of it becomes the issue, right? And how it becomes its own problem in that sense. But here we see the establishment of circumcision and as an expectation for these people. Now to the last round. Okay, the last round. And I know this isn't the last time that the promises are mentioned or anything like that. So it's just, I didn't think you all wanted to be here until we all passed out from lack of food or sleep. But round 5, chapter 18, jump down to verse 9. These strangers come up to Abraham. All right, Abraham's got his dwelling. We already know he's wealthy. He's doing quite well for himself. In verse 9, these strangers come up. We're really in the start of the chapter, and Abraham welcomes them in. He goes above and beyond. Hey, bake cakes for them. Let's go. Let's kill the calf, and let's cook it and give it to them, and then let them, be on their way when they are satisfied. But he goes above and beyond to show this hospitality and generosity. But as they're doing this, they basically, these 3 men go and ask Abraham, it's like, where's your wife? Where is she? And, tells them that, hey, she's out in the tent. And they say in verse 10, I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And it said Sarah was listening at the tent door, which was behind him. And Abraham and Sarah, they're advanced in age. Sarah herself has been barren her whole life, obviously. And so add on top of it the age factor for each of them. Abraham being about 100 and Sarah being about 90 years old. Sarah laughs. Sarah laughs about it, which is actually shows how in line she is with her husband, because in chapter 17, when God tells Abraham that Sarah is going to be the mother of this great nation that he is going to be the father of, Abraham also gets down on his face and laughs to himself. He laughs to himself, and you don't have to jump back to 17, but he laughs to himself, and then he kind of is like, okay, what do I say back to God? Well, clearly, like, God's talking about, hey, she's going to be the mother. Is like, his first response is like, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. So when God directly reveals this promise to him, and that Sarah is going to be the mother, and that it's going to happen soon, he immediately responds with, well, he must mean Ishmael, right? Ishmael's essentially her son by being a surrogate mother in this situation. Hagar is just the surrogate mother, and then Sarah is the actual mother. And God says, no, Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son. And now in verse 9 and verse 10, Sarah hears this, and in verse 12, she eventually has the same reaction. She laughs. I'm too old now. Like, this isn't going to happen. And funny enough, God has a sense of humor. You know that, right? God has a sense of humor, because God hears the response from both of these soon-to-be parents. They both laugh when he tells them that they're going to have a kid. And you know what God does? He's like, all right, I'm going to call your son. God laughs. All right, I'm going to call your son by the name that shows that I'm going to laugh. I laugh back at you for you doubting me that I can make this accomplished. So, but another layer of the promise is given to the point where God's like, okay, I told you it was going to be a great nation. I told you we're going to be the father. Now I'm telling you Sarah is going to be the mother. Now, in case you still have doubts, which Abram and Sarah clearly had their doubts, God says, okay, here's the timeline. By this time, next year, you're going to have a kid. All right. Now you know the date and the time of which to expect it. You're going to be the father. You're going to be the mother. This is when you're going to have a kid. Oh, and by the way, this is what you're going to name him. Okay? And so everything now in regards to this start of this family and this great nation, all right, which is going to follow through this son, God is telling him this is when it's going to happen. You know every detail you need to know now. It's going to happen. And I mentioned to you earlier, what's the significance of God repeating and repeating and repeating? It's not because he thought Abraham was stupid or that he had forgotten the promises or that he was totally ignorant that, hey, if I just tell him once, he's not going to get it or he's not going to care. The reason God continues to reestablish these promises over and over and over again is because he wants them to know it is going to happen. I am telling you once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 1,000,000 times, because I want you to know it's going to happen. It's not going to be an accident. You're not going to be able to question why these things come to pass. All right? You're going to know, why did I have that kid? Because God told me I would. Why am I going to be a great nation? Because God promised me I would. How am I blessed so greatly? Because God told me he would bless those who bless me and he would curse those who curse me. And so God would continually keep blessing me. And so God here has given him every detail he needs throughout this process. But there's also another layer here that we'll kind of wrap up on. Verse 19 of chapter 18. If you kind of jump down to verse 19, before God's going to go off to Sodom and Gomorrah and just, absolutely obliterate those monsters, he's talking to Abraham here. He doesn't have to tell Abraham what's going on. He doesn't have to tell Abraham he's going to wipe out Sodom and Gomorrah. These people who, from the very first moment we were introduced to them, back in chapter 13, when Lot and Abram separate, they never have a good thing to say about Sodom and Gomorrah. The land is beautiful. It's the greatest that it could possibly be down there around the Dead Sea. But the people are described as exceedingly wicked from the very moment we are introduced to them. And God's about to go and apply his justice to those people. But he turns and he says, shall I hide from Abraham, this being in verse 17 of chapter 18, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, since Abraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So here he restates all 3 of the promises. Verse 19, for I have chosen him so that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him. Another layer to this promise. God reminds the promises in their details of, hey, land, seed, nation. But now he's told them, okay, how do these things come about though? What's your end of the bargain? What's Abraham's end of the bargain? And that's when he tells them, hey, God's not just going to do this no matter what. It says, in order for these things to come about, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him, he has to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. So now God lays out for us specifically, all right, how do you receive those promises, Abraham? How is your line truly going to be this great nation, this people that possess this land, and these people who, through them, all the nations of the earth are blessed? By following after God, by keeping his commands, by keeping righteousness and justice as the foundations of this family, you will do that. And the reason it's significant that he brings that up is because God has told Abraham already, hey, you're not getting the land yet. You know why? Because I'm still enduring with these other people that God loves and values and wants the best for. I'm still trying to get the best out of them. I'm still trying to see if they will strive for righteousness and justice. I'm not yet ready to wipe out the Amorites. I want to see, will they turn back? Will they be good? But when they aren't, when that justice has to be exerted on those people, God's going to do it. And because of that, God will use that land to prosper the nation of Israel. But God is not one to just slack on promises for Abraham's line either, because in Leviticus, God talks about, why does he wipe out all those nations? Why does he kill all these people? Why would God do that? Because God is a just God, and when he sees the wickedness and how they had committed so many abominations, that's why he had to wipe them out. And in the verses following these promises in chapter 18, God goes to Sodom and Gomorrah. You know why God goes there? It's not just because God valued Abraham and he loved Abraham, and because Abraham wished for God to go and spare as many as he could, and so therefore he spares Lot, which God basically tells us in the next chapter, like, because his favor for Abraham, that's why he's going to these great lengths for Lot. But you know why God actually goes to Sodom and Gomorrah and he wipes out that land and those people? Is because their wickedness and the evil and the shedding of innocent blood and all that is so great that it cries out to God and demands justice be exerted upon them. Similar to what happened with Cain and Abel, when Cain lies to God about not seeing his brother, and God tells him, your brother's blood is crying out to me. God is a just God. And so when he shows Abraham these promises, when he reveals to him this nation, this land, this seed promise that's going to come about, he reminds him and shows him, hey, I'm also serious on the other end of you need to be a father of justice and righteousness, leading a family that exerts justice and righteousness as a people. Otherwise, you will be like the Amorites. You will be like the Canaanites. You will be like these wicked nations that I'm going to drive out before you and before your ancestors that are going to come after you. All right? These are all the promises that God keeps reminding us about over and over and over and over again. And he reminds us because he wants us to know they are true. And so, yes, the blessings, they are true. They are there. But if you exude and just pour out with wickedness, the justice of God is also a promise. That it is coming, that it is assured. And so, if there's anything that I could just finish with this morning's lesson, is just believe God when he says what he's going to do. Believe God when he says what he says. And while we've just read about the promises and we've seen them come to fulfillment, we've seen in Joshua how they went and they possessed the land. We saw how in Exodus 1, like when they're in slavery in Egypt, how they had multiplied to such a great force that the Egyptians were afraid of them and how God had fulfilled through that. And then when we get to the Gospels and we see how Jesus is the fulfillment of prophecy after prophecy after prophecy. And ultimately, he's the fulfillment of this promise. He's the fulfillment of this promise. And we saw that promise come to fruition and be achieved, despite the fact that Abraham never got to see it. Abraham never got to see the full fulfillment in his lifetime, but he knew it would come to pass. And so, while we've got to see all these promises come to fruition, the last promise that we can really hold on to is, I believe we brought up John 14 in class today. All right, and Jesus talks about, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. You know what Jesus also promises in that chapter? You know, he promises that he has gone to a place to prepare a place for us. And he says, if I go to prepare a place for you, know that I will come again and bring you to myself. So, where I am, you may be also. I don't know about you, but that sounds like a pretty good promise to me. And so while we have yet to see the fulfillment of that, we know people that have gone on before us. We believe that they are those who have lived that life of the promise being their motivator. We live lives believing that that is going to come to fruition, that God is going to welcome us back into that perfect unity with him, with the Son, with the Holy Spirit forever and ever. So believe the promises of God. He reminds us of them constantly throughout the scriptures, and we can know that they are true. Even if he said it once, they would have been true enough. But he reminds us just in case we need a secondary listen. So hopefully this gives you a little bit more confidence in the promises that God gives us, giving them to Abraham, and how we still have our own promises today that God has given to us, and we can trust in those promises, and those promises are assured. We live in a world where promises can't always be kept, but we serve a God who keeps all of his. So praise be to God for that. I pray whatever situation you're going through, whatever difficulties, high moments, low moments, whatever you're going through, go to God. Go to God in thanks, go to God in prayer for support, and go to each other. Go to each other to support each other. And this is a time we have to pray and support and to be and to comfort one another if we need that. Or if you're looking to devote your life to Christ, if you want to be a part of that promise, if you want to share in those promises, then now is the time to do it. So whatever needs you may have, we ask that you come forward as we stand and sing.